Peter, just follow up on Maria's question. And first of all, let me say I'm truly honored to have your endorsement. And I've begun to immerse myself in your writings. And the more I read, the more I want to have a long conversation with you and just pepper you with questions. There's so many aspects of it that's intriguing to me. But I want to start with a big picture question because it's one that has dominated the political debate within this wonderful leadership contest. And that is this notion of fiscal conservatism. Like degrowth, that could mean various things to various people, but what seems to be sort of at the core of the notion of fiscal conservatism within the debate that's happening in this leadership contest is the notion of prioritizing a balanced budget. And I was wondering if you might be able to comment on that. What are your views about the degree to which we should seek to balance the budget in the current circumstances we find ourselves in, particularly from an environmental and climate perspective?
First of all, I'm not a believer in a balanced budget for government. The mistake that some people make is to think of a government's budget in the same way as they think of a household budget. And with a household budget, you have to think about what your income is and how you're going to get by without going into debt. And when you get too heavily into debt, that's a problem. And that doesn't apply in the same way, particularly to a federal government, which has a control over the currency. By the way, this has all been brought to light very effectively by a recent book by Stephanie Kelton called The Deficit Myth. And anyone who is fixated on the deficit and getting rid of it should read that book because she puts the case very, very clear. Now, it takes us several hundred pages. I'm only going to speak for a few minutes about this. But basically, the argument is that governments do not have to tax and borrow to finance all their expenditures because they also control the money supply. They own the central bank. The bank can create money, as it's been doing for a very long time, and particularly in this situation, simply by keystrokes on a computer and adding to the reserves. And the other part of the story, which is one actually she doesn't pursue in that book, which is a bit disappointing for me, but the commercial banks also have the capacity to create money. So when somebody goes into the bank to borrow money, they're not borrowing somebody else's savings. The bank simply extends a loan if they believe that the loan will be repaid or that the borrower has the potential to repay the loan. So the whole question of what money is, where does money come from, fortunately, these issues have now surfaced. I have to say, I was trained as an economist, a PhD and all of that at UBC many years ago, and money was regarded as what we call a veil. You had the real economy, and this veil kind of sat upon it and didn't really get much attention. Money and banking was an elective. It wasn't even central to our study. So a lot of economists, I think, don't have an adequate appreciation of money and debt in the economy. Now, there's this term that's beginning to get a lot of notice called modern money theory, which has overturned a lot of the conventional thinking. And I think the experience of the pandemic, as you mentioned, really just gives evidence to show that money can be found when it's required. Now, let me just add one final comment. That doesn't mean that governments can just spend, spend, spend as if there's no limit. The limit is the limit on what the economy is capable of producing at any time. And if you overspend, you put so much money into circulation beyond what can be produced, then you get inflation. But that's the main concern. Well, we haven't had serious inflation, I don't know, for 2 decades at least, maybe more. So that's obviously not high on the agenda, and the government's been spending all of this money, and we still don't have inflation. In fact, if anything, a lot of the central banks around the world are worried about deflation. So, you know, there's a whole lot going on here, but the end result is to say there's way too much concern given to the government deficit. Can I add one more point that I want to make?
Please.
If you divide the economy into the public sector and everybody else, we'll call them the private sector, that includes trade. If the government borrows, it's because everybody else is lending. They're lending from their savings. If the government balances its budget, then it's impossible for everybody else to save. The two are opposite sides of the same coin, in fact. And so that's why I and others who subscribe to this modern money theory believe that it's important to have a government running a modest deficit, because that allows the private sector to save. It's quite interesting. All these ideas are really in the air now and need to be grabbed and worked with.
And we're actually having a conversation about modern money theory in the Green Party of Canada race, which for me is very encouraging. I just want to note, in passing, many people who are watching this may be interested to know that Stephanie Kelton was an advisor to the campaign of Bernie Sanders. And I myself, you know, have devoted a lot of time to understanding. There it is. I highly recommend that book. So if you haven't read it yet, please do.